Welcome to another futures video. I'd like to start off by showing a two-space that has dollars on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. Okay, and I'm showing various patterns of futures prices. The first case we'll look at is the full carry case. It's the black line, and this is showing various futures contracts. Such that the full carry model holds. In other words, the futures price along this black line is equal to the spot price plus carrying cost per unit. Now, on the time axis, the one refers to the amount of time until this futures contract has delivery as a possibility. The 2 refers to the amount of time until that futures contract becomes deliverable, and 3 means there's 3 periods before that futures contract becomes deliverable. So, and I've identified those dots on each of these lines. So full carry is our base case. Now, when we talked about cash and carry arbitrage, we were really talking about a circumstance along the purple line here. In other words, let's just choose number 2, for example, the futures contract that reaches or will have delivery in 2 periods. This is the full carry price right here, but the actual price of the futures contract was right there. And as we saw, whenever the futures price is higher than it should be, cash and carry arbitrage is called for. That's why I've labeled this cash and carry arbitrage up here. Okay, now let's look at the green line. That's the line for reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage. Let me put Q's in here to remind you that it's really a quasi-arbitrage. They often use the word arbitrage, but it's really not. So along the green line, we have a reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage circumstance. We actually have 2 of them, the green line and the blue line. Let me talk about the green line first. And the green line is basically saying, hey, using the second month contract to start, the price of the futures contract in equilibrium given carrying cost per unit and the spot price would be this value, but right now it's right here. Well, that means the futures price is lower than it should be, and as we saw in the last video, that's where we execute reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage. And so we understand that. Now, the negatively sloped blue line is another reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage circumstance. In other words, we have the, using the second month contract again, we have the futures price lower than it should be in full carry, so a reverse cash and carry arbitrage or quasi-arbitrage would be desirable. So we have 2 circumstances where reverse cash and carry arbitrage is appropriate. Now, let's look at a little more depth into some of these things. Not really depth, but more just naming. The full carry line and the cash and carry quasi-arbitrage line, the black and the purple lines, represent what are called contango markets. Contango markets. Positive slope, and the basis is negative for these 2. Now, the basis is also negative for this reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage because we see the, you imagine a horizontal line coming across from the spot price here. I'll make it pink. There we go, horizontal line, that's the spot price, right? And we can see the green line lies above that, and so you're still going to have a negative basis, but reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage is called for here. Here we had a negative slope line. And cash and carry quasi-arbitrage was still called for. Okay, so the purple line and the black line represent what are called contango markets. Negative basis, positive slope, and then this line, the green line and the blue line, represent circumstances where reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage is appropriate. But both of these are said to be representing a pattern of futures prices known as backwardation. Okay, backwardation. And backwardation means that the basis is positive, or the basis is negative but less than full carry, and we've got both those circumstances shown in the green and the blue lines. So that's some notation, some wording that you should be familiar with. And so spend a few moments staring at this screen. Kind of a lot going on there, but it's helpful to think of entire patterns of future prices that satisfy, full carry or don't. And if the pattern doesn't satisfy full carry, how could we describe it? And so that's a very important graph. So please pay some attention to that. Now, you might ask, can cash and carry arbitrage activity always take place? And the answer is yes. Cash and carry quasi arbitrage can always be executed. There are no impediments. You might ask, can reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage always take place? And the answer is not always. No, not always. And the typical impediment that keeps reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage activity from taking place is that there may be a shortage of the spot asset. And you remember, with reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage activity, we have to short sell the spot asset. So a shortage of the physical commodity is the most likely obstacle to seeing reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage activity take place. And so what that means is that sometimes futures prices can go very low. As a matter of fact, sometimes we'll get futures prices, as is the case along this blue line, where the futures price is lower than the spot price. And it's the shortage of the physical commodity that causes that. At peaks of business cycles, it is not uncommon to find industrial metal futures prices in backwardation. So keep that in mind. Now, we've seen that because cash and carry quasi arbitrage activity can always take place, that futures prices won't get too high, and there will be an effective lower bound on the basis. And what we've just mentioned is that because reverse cash and carry quasi arbitrage activity cannot always take place, we will sometimes not have a lower bound on futures prices, and we will not have an upper bound on the basis. In fact, the basis can become positive, indicating the cash price is greater than the futures price. If you think about it, when the cash price is greater than the futures price, there must be some other factor that's influencing the pricing of the futures contract. And that's often referred to as convenience yield. Maybe manufacturers that are using an industrial metal value having inventories of copper or silver on hand so as to not risk halting the production process. So convenience yield is a concept that comes into play in that regard. So you might say that futures price equals cash price plus carrying costs per unit, and then minus convenience yield. So, if you had to model it, you might model it like that. Okay? But I just want you to be aware of that. Okay. So, let's just chat a bit about futures markets now. Futures markets allow for risk transfers to those individuals or entities that are more willing to bear risk. Futures markets allow for risk transfers to those that are more willing and I guess more able to bear risk. And then others want to hedge, and hedging involves reducing or controlling risk. Speculators will always assume risk. Speculators assume risk. They're not hedging, they're speculators. Okay, and it's important to realize that hedgers, not speculators, but hedgers willingly give up the opportunity to have higher profits in the event of favorable price changes in order to reduce their risk exposure. So our prior example where the farmer locked in the $5 per bushel selling price of wheat, by the farmer taking short positions in futures contracts, the farmer was giving up potential benefits that would accrue to him if at harvest the spot price of wheat were to be higher than $5 a bushel. But farmers do that because the reduction in risk is something that they find appealing. Okay? And so we know that hedgers are seeking to control price risk, and that's whether it's cost or revenue risk, they're trying to control that price risk. Revenue risk is what's controlled by short hedgers like the farmer. Cost risk, the cost of an input, the risk associated with that moving against you, actually either moving for you or against you, both are risk. That would be the case with a long hedger. Okay, and of course hedging involves taking an opposite position in futures contracts than is your position in the spot asset. Remember, spot asset and cash asset are synonyms. So hedging involves taking an opposite position in futures than is your position in the cash asset, or maybe not a position in the cash asset, but a future spot market obligation. I should probably say a future spot asset obligation. Okay. Now, if a futures position is to be successful in reducing price risk, okay, if a hedger's use of futures is to be successful in decreasing price risk, changes in the value of the cash position caused by changes in the cash price, these changes must be offset. So must be offset by changes in the value of the futures position that come about as a consequence of changes in the future price, the price of the futures contract. That's what's going on when you're hedging. That's kind of what you're trying to do. It's not complicated, but it's nice just to spell it out and think through it. Now, I'll remind you again that hedgers lock in the price of the futures contract, for better or worse. Okay, now, interesting concept. The concept of a perfect hedge. A perfect hedge. Okay. Perfect hedge would exist if the basis does not change and the sizes of the cash and futures position are equal. So that would be a perfect hedge. Basis doesn't change, and the size of the cash and futures positions are equal. Okay? Perfect hedge. Okay? If we have a contango market, okay, so with a contango market, a narrowing of the basis. Narrowing of the basis benefits the short hedger. A narrowing of the basis benefits the short hedger, our farmer in our examples. Okay, so that can be shown like this. There's a contango market. And as this dashed line is the spot price, and as expiration approaches, which means as time passes, we go in this direction. Okay, the basis is narrowing. Okay, the basis is narrowing. Narrowing is a word that really is getting at the concept of absolute value. Okay, it's just getting smaller in absolute value. So that's keep this in mind. With a contango market, a narrowing of the basis benefits the short hedger. If the market were in backwardation, a widening of the basis would benefit the short hedger. But this is probably an important one to keep in mind, and focus on that. Now, changes in the basis can dramatically alter the results of hedging. Okay, changes in the basis can dramatically alter the results of your hedging. Okay, and in fact, usually it's the case that changes in futures prices are not equal to the associated changes in cash prices associated by time. Okay, and so that, if you think about it, if the size of the change in the futures price doesn't equal the size of the change in the cash price, okay, that's going to give us a new element of risk. Look at it this way. The basis, the basis is equal to the cash price minus the futures price, okay? And therefore, a change in the basis would be equal to the change in the cash price minus the change in the futures price. Okay? If the change in the futures price was equal to the change in the cash price, then that would imply the change in the basis would be zero, right? If, on the other hand, the change in the cash price does not equal the change in the futures price, the implication is we've got a new source of risk, and that implies the existence of basis risk. Okay? Basis risk. So the big idea here is that hedgers use futures contracts to control price risk. But now what we're seeing, and this is very important, is that when you use futures contracts to control price risk, you are effectively forced to take on basis risk. So it would just make sense that this basis risk we're taking on has to be much smaller than the price risk that we're trying to hedge using futures. That's just logic. So make sure you are comfortable with that concept. And the variance of the basis is how we quantify basis risk. Basis risk is the variance of the basis. Okay, So sigma square b, the variance of the basis, then of course is equal to the variance of the basis. But now I'm going to write the basis as cash price minus the futures price. Okay, the variance of cash price minus the futures price, because this will allow us to make some interesting observations. So what we have here then is the variance of the basis is then equal to the variance of the cash price plus the variance of the futures price. Now, since this is a minus sign, okay, something we saw in portfolio theory videos, now we have a minus sign. Minus 2 times the covariance of cash price and futures price. Okay, so what's new here from what you've seen in portfolio theory is this is now a minus. It's a minus because that's a minus. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to plug in the correlation equivalent for this term now. Plug in the correlation equivalent. Write it in blue now. So we're going to have the variance of the basis equals variance of the cash price plus variance of the futures price minus 2 times the correlation coefficient between the cash price and the futures price times the standard deviation of the cash price times the standard deviation of the futures price. Okay, so this is our equation where we've plugged in this for this, and it's going to be it's going to help us make some observations here in a minute. Okay, so this equation shows us that basis risk would be 0. So basis risk would be 0 when the variance of the cash price equals the variance of the futures price, and the correlation coefficient between the cash price and the futures price is equal to 1. Okay? In that case, basis risk would be 0. Variance of the cash price is equal to variance of the futures price, and the correlation coefficient between the returns of the cash price and the futures price is equal to 1. Some numbers here are probably helpful. Now, so if this holds, then you might have an equation that looks like this. Variance of the basis equals variance of the cash price, let's say that's 4, plus variance of the futures price, let's say that's 4, minus 2 times the correlation coefficient, that's 1, times the standard deviation of the cash price, well, that's 2, times the standard deviation of the futures price, that's 2. And if you see this is 4 plus 4 is 8, minus 2 times 2 times 2 times 1 is 8 minus 8 is 0. Okay, so that goes to show that, yeah, well, you know, that's true. When these two items here are both true, then variance of the basis is 0. Just to show you a circumstance when though these two don't hold, the variance of the basis might look like this. Maybe the variance of the cash price is 25, and we'll keep variance of the futures at 4, minus 2 times 1 times 5 times 2. Okay, so that's going to be 29 minus 20, or 9. So there we've got a variance of the basis that's non-zero, and in this case positive. And so, of course, its variance is always going to be positive, but it's 9. So that's kind of helpful to see that there, I think. In the real world, rho matters the most. Rho being the correlation coefficient. In the real world, rho matters the most. Okay? And you should know that the correlation coefficient between cash prices and futures prices is never, those correlations never equal 1. And that implies, okay, that implies that hedgers, this is important, always assume basis risk. I'll put the word some in there, some basis risk. Hedgers always assume some basis risk. And as I mentioned before, in order to reduce their exposure to price risk of the, if they're a farmer, of the commodity they're trying to harvest, in order to reduce their exposure to the price risk of that commodity, the farmer, the hedger, must accept in return an exposure to basis risk. Okay? And of course, one last point here. For a hedge to be attractive, something that you would find appealing, okay, the basis risk should be much lower than the price, we'll say the hedger's price risk. Again, in order for a hedge to be attractive, to be beneficial to the hedger, basis risk must be much lower than the hedger's price risk. Basis risk must be much lower than the hedger's price risk. One more time. In order for a hedge to be attractive and potentially benefit a hedger, basis risk must be much lower than the hedger's price risk. And that will be enough for this video. Thanks for watching.